Before the blade ever touched the neck of France's most despised queen, her enemies made sure to deliver one final act of cruelty. Something deliberate, almost theatrical. They didn't just want her gone. They wanted her wiped from memory. Her descent from a throne covered in gold to a rough wooden cart, rolling through streets filled with screaming ex-subjects, wasn't just an execution. It was a ritual of erasure. Every jolt of that cart was meant to strip away what little remained of her identity as a queen. But they didn't succeed. What follows is the story of what they did to Marie Antoinette in her final hours, and how she somehow met that cruelty with a kind of dignity that defied the humiliation around her. Forget the glittering mirrors and chandeliers of Versailles. My story begins somewhere much darker, in the cold, rat-infested dungeons of the Conciergerie prison in Paris. This medieval fortress, grimly known as the antechamber to the guillotine, was where the enemies of the revolution took their last breath. On the night of August 2, 1793, after months of captivity with her family, Marie Antoinette was ripped away from her children and her daughter-in-law and brought here, to this place of final waiting. From that moment on, she was completely alone. For 76 long days, the woman who had once ruled France was no longer a queen. She was simply prisoner number 280. Her cell was pitiful, tiny, damp, with water seeping down the walls and a single straw mattress on the floor. Solitude, which had once been a rare luxury, was now a punishment she could barely endure. 2 guards were stationed in her cell around the clock, their eyes following her every move. They watched her choke down the tasteless prison rations, watched her struggle to fall asleep, and even watched her try to pull on a thin, worn coat. This constant, unbroken surveillance was its own form of violence, a slow and calculated way to strip her of her humanity. For a woman who had once moved freely through private palaces, it was the most cutting kind of insult. Yet even that physical misery couldn't compare to the pain they inflicted on her heart. Only a few months earlier, in the dead of night, the Revolutionary Guards had stormed into her room at the Temple prison. They had come for her little boy, 8-year-old Louis Charles. Witnesses later described a scene of chaos. A desperate mother throwing herself between the guards and her child, pleading with them not to take him away, while her teenage daughter, Marie Therese, clung to her brother, sobbing uncontrollably. But they tore the boy from her arms. She would never see him again. The only pieces of him she had left were a tiny portrait and a few curls of his hair that she kept hidden inside her corset. It wasn't the loss of the throne that broke her. It was the loss of her children. Her maid, Rosalie Merlier, who cared for her in the conciergerie, later said that the only time she ever saw the queen truly collapse into tears was when she spoke about them. By mid-October, the final act of her tragedy was ready to play out. On October 14, 1793, Marie Antoinette was hauled before the Revolutionary Tribunal in what was supposed to be a trial, but in truth it was nothing more than political theater. Unlike her husband, King Louis XVI, who had at least a week to prepare a defense, she was given less than a single day. The charges were absurd. A tangled mess of political accusations and wild gossip, much of it copied straight from the scandal sheets that had slandered her for years. They accused her of sending French funds to Austria, plotting mass murders, and organizing obscene orgies in Versailles. But one charge went further than all the rest. It wasn't just meant to condemn her. It was meant to poison her very soul in the eyes of the people. The prosecutor, a fanatic named Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville, accused her of something monstrous, corrupting her own son. The boy, Louis Charles, had been manipulated, forced to sign a statement against his mother. For a long, unbearable moment, Marie Antoinette said nothing. The courtroom murmured, restless. Then she rose. She didn't bother looking at the judges or her accusers. Instead, she turned toward the gallery, toward the women of Paris who filled the benches, many of them the same women who had once marched to Versailles demanding her death. Her voice was steady, clear, and strong as she said, "I appeal to all the mothers present in this hall." It was a stroke of brilliance. In that instant, she wasn't the foreign-born Austrian woman or the hated Madame Deficit. She was a mother defending herself against a vile and impossible lie. You could feel the change in the air. The women in the crowd, Mothers themselves shifted, murmuring in her defense. For a fleeting moment, the old power returned. She was once again the woman who had held a royal court in the palm of her hand. But it didn't last. The moment passed like smoke. The verdict was never in doubt. In the early hours of October 16th, after only 2 days of proceedings, the jury of men declared her guilty of treason. The sentence was death. When they asked if she had anything left to say, Marie Antoinette simply shook her head. What words could possibly matter now? Back in her cell, she refused her final meal. "I don't need anything else, my child," she told her maid, Rosalie, her voice quiet but steady. "It's all over for me." With calm determination, she took up a pen and wrote what would become her last, heartbreaking letter to her sister-in-law, begging her to forgive the young son who had been forced to testify against his own mother. That letter never reached its destination. It was intercepted, locked away by her enemies, and only discovered many years later. When morning light began to creep across Paris, the next stage of her humiliation began, this time physical, deliberate, and cruelly choreographed. The guards ordered her to remove the black mourning gown she had worn every day since her husband's execution. That dress had become a symbol of who she once was, a widow, a queen, and a woman of dignity. But the revolutionaries would have none of it. They stripped her of that last emblem of pride and gave her a plain, worn white chemise, the kind worn by repentant sinners, not royalty. When she tried to change, she asked the guard for a single moment of privacy. He refused. There was no mercy left for her. Then came the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson. One of his assistants grabbed a handful of her hair, once piled high and adorned with jewels, now dulled and limp from stress. With rough, unsteady hands, he hacked it off using a pair of scissors. It was more than a practical act to clear the way for the guillotine blade. It was a symbolic strike, meant to strip her of her femininity and her status as a queen. Next, they bound her hands tightly behind her back. "They didn't tie my husband's hands," she protested, showing a flicker of defiance. But no one listened. The ropes were pulled so tight they dug into her wrists, causing sharp pain. Even for the simplest human necessity, she had to ask permission. Before being taken away, she quietly requested to relieve herself in the corner of her cell. It was a small, humiliating gesture of a woman who once commanded a nation. At 11 o'clock that morning, the gates of the conciergerie groaned open. King Louis XVI had been taken to his death in a closed carriage, his last moments hidden from the jeering mob. Marie Antoinette was given no such mercy. Waiting for her was a rough, open wooden cart, the kind used for common criminals. They forced her to sit on a plank, her hands still tied, fully exposed to the public. The ride to the Place de la Révolution took over an hour. The streets were packed. Tens of thousands of Parisians pressed shoulder to shoulder, their faces twisted with anger and mockery. They jeered, spat, and shouted curses as the cart rolled by. The painter Jacques-Louis David, a fervent supporter of the revolution, stood on a balcony sketching the scene. He captured her in his notebook, her pale, proud face framed by shorn hair, her expression defiant even in disgrace. The cart jolted so violently at one point that she nearly lost her balance. Still, she did not flinch. Marie Antoinette sat upright, her back straight as a rod. Her face, though drained of color, held the calm composure of someone who had already made peace with her fate. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just stared ahead, unblinking, a solitary figure of quiet strength in the middle of a roaring storm of hatred. At last, the cart rolled into the Place de la Révolution, what we now call the Place de la Concorde. In the center stood the guillotine, its tall wooden frame cutting a sharp outline against the pale October sky. The crowd surged forward, hungry for the bloody spectacle they'd been promised. But when Marie Antoinette stepped down from the cart, something in her seemed transformed. After months of humiliation and pain, she carried herself with a calm that no one could quite explain. Eyewitnesses described her as poised, steady, even graceful. Without accepting a hand from the executioner, she began to climb the wooden steps of the scaffold on her own. Near the top, in a strange twist of fate, She accidentally stepped on the foot of her executioner, Charles Henri Sanson. The same man who had cut her hair, bound her hands, and was now only moments away from ending her life. For a brief instant, the crowd went silent. She turned to him, her voice soft but clear, and spoke her final words. "Pardon me, sir. I did not mean to do it." It was a small, quiet apology, but it was also extraordinary. In that fleeting moment, she showed a kind of grace that defied everything they had done to her. Her final act was not one of fear or anger, but of decency. A last, quiet rebellion against the hatred surrounding her. It was her way of saying, "You may take my life, but you cannot take my humanity." At precisely 12:15 in the afternoon, the blade dropped. It was quick. Sanson's assistant lifted her severed head by the pale hair and held it high for the roaring crowd to see. A wave of shouts rolled through the square. "Vive la République! Long live the Republic!" Her body was tossed without ceremony into the same rough cart that had carried her to her death. From there, it was taken to a nearby cemetery and buried in an unmarked pit with other victims of the Revolution. The last Queen of France was laid to rest as a commoner, stripped of name, title, and honor. But that was not the end of her story. According to legend, the young wax sculptor who would later become known as Madame Tussaud was summoned to make a death mask from the Queen's severed head. It was a grim, macabre task, and one that would forever tie her name to Marie Antoinette's ghost. More than 20 years passed before the final chapter was written. In 1815, after the monarchy was restored, King Louis XVIII ordered that the remains of his brother, Louis XVI, and his sister-in-law, Marie Antoinette, be exhumed. Their bones were carefully identified and finally laid to rest with royal honors in the Basilica of Saint Denis, the ancient resting place of France's kings and queens. The French Revolution had set out to erase her completely, to destroy every trace of the monarchy and to turn a queen into a monster. They stripped her of her crown, her children, her dignity, and at last, her life. But in the end, they failed, because in that final, fragile moment, when she bowed her head and offered a simple apology to the man about to kill her, Marie Antoinette reclaimed her humanity. They took her crown, they took her head, but they could never take away the quiet, unshakable dignity that history would remember forever.